Moin alle Götten. Mein Name ist Cosimo Suglia. Ich war letztes Jahr am Prix Laurence Finalist. Letztes Jahr als eine von meinen Shortstories an Guy Luxembourgeois rausgekommen. An Haut lesen ich eine Shortstory für die heißt Beyond the Graveyard, die wird mehr spät an einer Anthologie von Black Fountain Press das Jahr veröffentlicht gehen. Ich hoffe, ihr habt viel Spaß einmal da. Merci danke und Jerome, dass in die Plattform hier möglich wird. Und ja, ich lese da Luft hier. Beyond the Graveyard. Are you lost, little boy? The cat's voice echoed through Matthew's mind. The full moon stood tall beyond the graveyard. No, not really, Matthew answered. He pinched his right arm so hard it left a bruise the size of a coin. This most definitely was not a dream. Two cats, one as white as the clouds on a midsummer day, the other as black as the darkest charcoal after a furious forest fire, were proudly resting on a grave. It was a fairly regular grave. It had granite standing tombstone which was rectangular with rounded corners and a stanza of a beautiful poem. Probably Yeats, Matthew thought, but only because it was the only poet he knew besides Dr. Seuss. The grave belonged to a certain jasmine port. Not that any of this mattered, really. After all, Matthew was having small talk with cats in a graveyard at midnight, the day before Halloween. Awful place to sleep, for a human at least. Contrary to your kind, we enjoy the snug companionship of death, the black cat said, nobly strutting around the grave of poor old Jasmine. Are you sure you aren't lost? Don't be rude, Circe, the white cat hissed. Pretty sure. Why else would I have a sleeping bag? Matthew answered. He pointed to the bench in front of the chestnut tree. A green and white dotted sleeping bag was laid on it. Wise color choice, little boy, Circe remarked, before getting lightly tapped on the head by Medea. Matthew began to feel the heat rising up to his ears. Having his fashion choice criticized by one cat and offended by another was the least of his problems. Are you not afraid of this place? Medea continued to question Matthew in a certain motherly way. It was kind of soothing, the tone of her voice, like a cup of hot tea after a day outside in the snow. Nothing made Matthew afraid of the graveyard, really, except maybe the creaks of the old chestnut tree, which sounded as if hellhounds were roaming the hedges, ready to drag any living body away, and maybe the fact that two cats were talking to him so casually, but besides that, it was rather cozy. I'm not, he answered, stroking his newly formed bruise. If you say so, the black cat yawned. It had not been Matthew's first night in the graveyard. To others it might have seemed unusual the amount of nocturnal time he spent there, but any place was more welcome than his room at home, especially after his father finished the night shift. Unlike bedtime stories, violent arguments were no support for peaceful sleep. Who are you guys anyway? Matthew dared to ask. Oh, little man, that is a question not easily answered, Circe said. When Medea looked down, her face decorated with worry. Circe was now sprawled along the grave, her head and chest raised, supported by crossed front paws. Medea sat upright, her blue eyes looking at Matthew, her tail swinging rhythmically from left to right. We are, Circe said, looking deep into Matthew's eyes. Witches. Matthew stared blankly at both cats for several minutes without uttering a word, before turning around and sitting on the bench. He began to weep, and it gradually evolved into a sob, and finally into a fully fledged wail. Both witches looked at each other. They might have seen countless reactions to this revelation before, but never in the form of a child crying. This took even Circe and Medea by surprise. Hey, little man! Medea jumped up from the grave and went over to Matthew, brushing her face against his. Don't cry. We are not of the evil kind. We use our magic to do good. Mostly, Circe whispered to herself. You use magic to do good things? Matthew asked, his sentence being interrupted by a cry-induced hiccup. Medea was happy that he had somewhat calmed down. Yes, she nodded vigorously. Could you do something good for me? Medea and Circe looked at each other. It depends what it is you want us to do, little boy. Medea had a worried look on her face. Can you bring Grandma back from the dead? Matthew's voice cracked. She died a few months ago, and so I had to move back in with Mom and Dad, but they don't look after me, and all they do at home is argue with each other. Dad hits Mom, and Mom hits me, and she says it's my fault that they are arguing, and that is why I come here to sleep. Matthew broke out once again into a sob. Grandma raised me since I was a baby, and I dearly miss her. Medea caressed Matthew's face again, and the warmth of her fur calmed him down a little. We cannot, little man. Circe was sitting on the grave, her chest puffed up. She added, Death is something not to be toyed with, no matter what the circumstances are, but I understand your wish and your life seems miserable right now. There's something alone you can do. And that is? Matthew replied. Become more, Circe said, in the name of your grandmother. What do you mean, more? I'm just a little boy, as you said before. A little boy who has recognized his misfortune. A little boy who knows where to hide from evil. A little boy who, even though he is filled with fear, can sleep in this ghastly graveyard and was able to talk with two strange cats so casually. And, at the mention of magic, I could see it in your eyes. All you were thinking about was another person. Your grandmother. Circe now slowly prowled towards Matthew. She was reminiscent of a proud puma carefully placing one paw before the other, her body swinging ever so elegantly. I still do not understand, Matthew replied. You could easily have asked us to get rid of your parents. Circe now sat in front of Matthew. Stop it, Circe, Medea intervened, but Circe continued. You have one of the most important virtues of any being, little man. That of selfless love. She's right, you know, Medea softly agreed. But how does that help me right now? I dread going home. My parents do not love me, they see me as a curse. Well, there might be something we could do. Circe's face, even in her cat form, was as smug as any lawyer winning a case. But you have to make a big sacrifice, and also trust us. Matthew looked at Medea, and all he could see was her eyes. Eyes worth any sacrifice. Eyes like his grandmother's. Anything, he responded, his face lit with ambition. Oh, wonderful. I think the title of little boy is a mere waste on you. What is your name? Circe quickly turned in a circle before jumping onto the bench. Matthew. My name is Matthew. Well, Matthew, as of now, you will be my new apprentice. Welcome to your new path, the path of a witch. Medea brushed against Matthew's face even harder than before, joining Circe in her exhilaration. A witch? He pinched his bruise yet again. Medea, do it, Circe exclaimed. I do hope you are ready, Matthew. Ready for what? The bruise grew beyond the size of a coin. It now resembled a plum and would later share similar colors. The initiations, of course. Circe positioned herself on the grave yet again. Medea sat on the gravel in front of Matthew. Her eyes were closed and she mumbled words in a language Matthew had never heard before. A circle around him started to glow. It reminded him of the full moon he had so appreciated the past few nights. The circle started to spin and then to be lifted by Medea. A tiny cat paw held a dark wooden stick with a handle covered in white leather. Matthew was now encapsulated by a shining cylinder. He tried to touch the wall encircling him, but as he extended his arm he could see something was happening to his body. His hands were shrinking and becoming covered with a greyish fur, and sharp needle-like claws peeked through the tips of his newly formed paws. He was transforming into a cat, just like his mentors to be. New smells overwhelmed Matthew like a punch of cinnamon on the morning of Christmas Eve. The intense odor coming from the tree left him longing for a roasted chestnut. His new eyes adjusted to the encompassing darkness, and he could see the graveyard crystal clear, in all its splendor. Nonetheless, one thing bothered Matthew. Circe and Medea were now towering over him. His ego was slightly damaged. It was especially bothersome once both started brushing against his now cute little cat face, Circe on the left and Medea on the right. Matthew purred, unintentionally. Merci.